All right, let's talk about the next steps. After Stalin took power, he started to actually implementing some of the policies in this idea of collectivization.
Yeah.
What's the story of that in the 20s, leading into the 30s? What was this idea? What was the relationship between the regime, the ideology, and the farmers?
Well, there's always been, and obviously very much this day, an enormous amount of enmity, for lack of a better term, hatred between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, this is, centuries in the making, if not more. And the Ukraine, or Ukraine now, but at the time, I'm speaking of the region, is and still is the breadbasket of Europe. It was very fertile lands. This is where the food comes from. And this was a issue also for Lenin, as I discuss in the book, because when you had famines there, you have famines throughout what later became the Soviet Union. And the problem is this happened in North Korea as well in the 90s when they don't have food. If you let in foreigners and feed your people, all of a sudden you as the government are either superfluous or downright, deleterious to their well-being, and that's a threat to your power. So Lenin let in an American organization, the early 20s, which was actually headed by Herbert Hoover, of all people. And after a while, Hoover left because he found that the Bolsheviks were just taking the grain that the Americans were giving to feed the people and selling it for export, while the people suffered. And one of the people who grew up in these starvation times was a young Mikhail Gorbachev, where he had, I think it was like a quarter or a third of his village starved to death during one of these periodic famines. Stalin's idea, this was a good mechanism for him to break the idea of Ukraine being an independent nation within its own identity. And, he had this kind of liquidation of the kulaks, very famously, which thankfully is much more discussed now than it was maybe when you and I were kids. And a kulak, the real meaning or the literal meaning is kind of this wealthy landowner, right? But very quickly, it's kind of like it becomes outgroup.
Mhm.
So, there was a big incentive to call someone you didn't like a kulak, and then good luck to you because now the eyes of the state are on you, and you have to prove that you didn't hire people, you didn't have 4 cows or how many acres or so and so forth. They took a huge percentage of the population, the kulaks, and they just deported them. These are lands that they had for generations, and they just spread them throughout uh, uh, broader Russia. Many of them never made it, and many of them were killed. This was by design.
And the dark thing about the kulaks, like you said, when it becomes abused, when it becomes the out group, is the kulak is supposed to be wealthier than sort of the general
Right.
farmer peasant, and so basically it gives you a mechanism of resentment. Anybody
Yes.
that's better off must be better off because they're kulak. Let's get rid of them, and it has a just from an economics perspective, even leaving ethics aside, it basically completely de-incentivizes productivity.
And
Like it wants you to fail because if you succeed, you're a kulak and you're going to be tortured, you're going to be deported, you're going to be derided, all that.
and also you're poor because he's rich. Like
Yeah.
that's a big part of
Yeah.
it. So while this was going on and food was becoming a problem because you had poor weather conditions, there was a campaign about, the reason you're hungry is because the kulaks are hoarding all their grain.
Yeah.
And if you're somewhere else in the Soviet Union, how are you supposed to know any better? Because you're being told every year the crops are bumper crop, bumper crop, bumper crop, and now there's no food, there's no bread. And so, you see, we produced all this bread. It's not getting to you because the kulaks are hoarding the grain. So they came like in what became known as the Holodomor, and Anne Applebaum, who's a great historian, who unfortunately I disagree with a lot in contemporary politics, but who's done so much great work about the Soviet Union that I pretty much give her a blank check on whatever she wants to say nowadays. She wrote a great book about this called Red Famine, and these activists descended on these villages like locusts, and their job was to requisition as much food as possible. And they would come back, at all hours of the night to make sure you weren't hiding food. And this is what was so pernicious about it. Your own body would betray you. They could look at you and see that you're not losing weight. You're got those chubby cheeks. That means you have food, and that's the government's food. that is the food of the people. And if you are keeping food for yourself, you are stealing from the people. You're an enemy of the people, and you deserve whatever comes to you. And it got to a point where they didn't have grain to plant for the next harvest. And what was even sicker is, one of the big criticisms of communists, of the Tsar, was his internal passport system, that I can't go where I want within Russia, the Russian Empire, without permission. Stalin reintroduced this. So if your village was targeted, you can't leave. Now, some people got away. They tried to get to the cities and so on and so forth. But you get to the city and you're starving. You have no clothes. You're a kulak. I'm hungry because of you. And now you're too lazy to work. Get the F out of there. And there were stories, I have them in the White Pill, of this like starving teenage girl, and she's begging for food. And the guy the shopkeep knocks the food out of her hand, and she dies on the spot. And everyone in that line knew not to, give her any food or any sympathy, because she's a kulak sympathizer. And very quickly, if you're a kulak sympathizer, all that has to happen is someone has to call, I think it was the NKVD at the time, they had different names for the Cheka, the secret police, and they had to be like, oh, you see, whatever her name was, Zhenya, she was a kulak sympathizer. We saw Kulak who was trying to shake us down for food because too lazy to work, and she felt so bad for them. So you might want to check in on Zhenya. So yeah.
But in 32 and 33, Holodomor, it wasn't just small injustice here and there. It was mass starvation.
Yes.
And suffering.
Yes. Millions starved to death in the Ukraine alone, and by design.
So you mentioned Anne Applebaum's book, Red Famine, Stalin's War in Ukraine. But another excellent book on the topic, and by the way, thank you for recommending that to me. So it was...
her work's amazing.
Yeah, it's a really, really powerful book about not just about Holodomor, but like the context of Ukraine, basically the history of Ukraine that's relevant for today.
Yeah.
To understand the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. But another great book is Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder. I don't know. I think you also recommended that to me at some point, or maybe not.
I haven't, but I'm familiar with it. I haven't read it.
So he does quite a bit of, it's brief, but extremely well-researched writing about cannibalism there.
Oh, God.
And that it was not uncommon during the Stalin-imposed famine in the Soviet Ukraine for parents to cook and eat their children. He writes, quote, "Survival was a moral as well as a physical struggle. A woman doctor wrote to a friend in June 1933 that she had not yet become a cannibal, but was not sure that I shall not be one by the time my letter reaches you." In quotes. The good people died first. Those who refused to steal or to prostitute themselves died. Those who gave food to others died. Those who refused to eat corpses died. Those who refused to kill their fellow man died. Parents who resisted cannibalism died before their children did. And there's stories in there about, cooking your children. The other thing about cannibalism, about famine in general, that stood out to me, that unlike a lot of atrocities, is the people that are starving are exhausted. They're basically unable to think. So they don't even have the energy to protest. It's a strange kind of way to kill thinking in the populace. That it kind of, I suppose it was obvious, but there's something fundamental about starvation where it slowly removes your humanity.
Yeah, there was a scene in the book where a lot of times people literally go crazy. And there's a scene where a mom at some train station was nursing her kid, and she was, going mad from hunger, and she just starts beating the crap out of her baby and kicking it, and then she just reverts to normal like nothing had happened.
Madness. Like you lose your mind.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know what the physiological cause of this. It's not just, I think it's, if someone has dealt with like glycogen depletion, it affects their mood, things like that. So taken to an extreme, who knows what happens when parts of the brain start functioning and start imploding.